Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled that one of my iconic role models is here with me today to chat about, well, whatever he wants to talk about. And I mean, of course, Tom Peters, the author of In Search of Excellence and many other books with excellence in their title. Someone who's really been instrumental in bringing people and humanity much more to the fore of management, and who has been carrying the cause for more human organizations for a long, long time. So Tom, it is such a pleasure to see you.
It's a pleasure to see you. The only slight problem, Rita, was I just had my 79th birthday. And so I'm trying to think of the meaning of iconic. It was funny. I got some Lifetime award a couple of years ago, and I had just seen, my wife and I had just been to I think it was on stage, a Monty Python show. And one of the things that they were selling in the, out front was a t-shirt that said, "Not dead yet." And so I brought that with me to the award ceremony, which was a tuxedo ceremony. And I said, I know what the real meaning of a Lifetime Achievement Award is. And it was great fun. So I'll deal with iconic, but whatever.
Well, it's true. You had a big impact. I remember when I was first reading In Search of Excellence, and it had such an outsized impact on the way we think about organizations, just at the time, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff has now become so well accepted, we don't remember how unusual it was, but the whole theme of management by walking around, for example, like actually figuring out what was going on at the front lines of your organization was an astonishing thing for the bureaucratic and sort of systems-driven managers of their time.
Well, and again, this is exaggeration. Well, it isn't exaggeration. I considered the interview that my co-author Bob Waterman and I had with John Young at Hewlett Packard, where we were introduced to MBWA. That is, to use that word again, my iconic moment. In retrospect, it changed my life without any question. And what was really fascinating about it, which given where you are, you would appreciate, is I was working for McKinsey at the time, before they started screwing around with Purdue Pharma. We can either touch that or not. I'm furious about it. But we were in the San Francisco office. We were in the relatively new Bank of America tower, and we were on the 49th floor, and the Bank of America was on, the big people were on the 50th floor. And as I said to somebody, the people up there had their tea out of China that had been in Buckingham Palace a few years before. So anyway, so we go down to HP. It just passed the $1 billion mark. So it wasn't the monster it subsequently became, but it was real. And the whole day was amazing. Bob and I went down 30 miles from San Francisco, 32 miles, and went up to the front desk. There was such a thing. And said, we got a meeting with John Young, and given our experience with the 50th floor, we expected to see the executive assistant to the executive assistant. And about 3 minutes later, Young pops out and says, I'm John. At which point we go back to the office of the president of the Hewlett Packard Corporation, which is an 8x8 cubicle that in ye olde days, he actually shared with his secretary. And in the middle of all that, he introduced us to the HP way and to this silly thing called MBWA, managing by wandering around. And to my interior, it's a true statement. My life changed with that sentence, though I didn't know it at the time. And after we had our conversation with him, he said, "Okay, guys," he said, "you probably think I'm bullshitting you. Come on, let's take a walk." And his office was right next to one of the engineering spaces. And so we go out into the engineering spaces. I mean, God really was winking at me that day. We go out into the engineering spaces. First of all, John knew practically everybody. They were probably the modal person there was a 32-year-old engineer, what have you. And there's this, excuse my language, there's this old fart talking to a young engineer over in the corner. And John said, "Come on over, I want you to meet somebody." I wish I had a Bible because I would really like to swear on the Bible that I'm telling you the truth. So we go over and John said, Tom and Bob, I want you to meet Bill Hewlett. And it was like,
Wow.
And Bill Hewlett was engaged in a real conversation about real problems or issues with a 32-year-old engineer. And you remember those giant screen computers sitting at one of those. And, I had, you were talking about something. It sounds so stupid. I had no idea that leadership of a sizable organization could be intimate. I mean, that is the word I would use. And, that then became, little did we know it, the signature for everything.
Well, and if you think about it, right, the legendary leaders, the ones that we hold up as examples that are unfortunately not that widespread, but people like Herb Kelleher at Southwest, who would, unapologetically take a place on the baggage handling thing, right? Or Brad Anderson at Best Buy. I remember one of my colleagues.
Who's Brad?
Sorry?
Who is Brad Anderson?
Yeah. Wasn't it Best Buy? And
I think he's right.
he would take criticism like in these big all hands corporate meetings from like frontline people, and he'd say thank you, and he honestly meant it. Sam Walton, famous for like if you were selling milk and you were the like division manager of a Waltons, and he would go across the street and go to like Piggly Wiggly or something, and if their milk was 2 cents cheaper, you had to answer for it. I mean, Ingvar Kamprad, right? Retail is detail, and he meant it. So
actually, my favorite Sam Walton story, I got to know him. There was something called the Sales Executives Hall of Fame, and Sam got inducted one year, and to my great delight, astonishment, and amazement, I was asked to introduce him. And it was at the Waldorf Astoria. And I'm not trying to inflate myself, but one of the people at the nearby table was Ronald Reagan, who was introducing Bob Hope. I mean, Jesus Christ. At any rate,
you've made it when.
Oh my God, it was not a normal day. But at any rate, so I got up, and that mistress of ceremonies was Barbara Walters. And so I got up, and I don't know if it came to me on the spot or not, but I said, it's my great honor to talk to you about Sam Walton. I said, and in this room of 500 grand people, Sam and I have one thing in common that is not true of the rest of you. Both of us are wearing rented tuxedos. And it was you can imagine the Waldorf, you can imagine the formality of it. And Alice Walton, who started the museum down in Bentonville subsequently, that is so amazing. Alice came up to me afterwards, I don't remember how old she was, and she gave me this big bear hug. And she said, that was a life highlight. But
that is a great story. That is a great story.
And Sam would have died 1,000 deaths if he had seen the amount of stuff being bought from China, because he was doing made in the USA long before anybody talked about made in the USA. I'm not sure that Walmart really had a choice, but nonetheless, that was so. He was famous for driving a 25-year-old pickup truck with his dog in the back. And I don't think he grew up. Walmart was in the upper left-hand corner of Arkansas, and he grew up right up north in the far western side of Missouri, actually, I think. Oh, and he grew up on the other side, far side of Missouri, and he worked for James Cash Penney himself. I think that was the story.
I'm pretty sure it was. So there's a great story that I love to tell, because it, so much of what you read, like in business school case studies or books, is just made up out of thin cloth. So, if you read the history of many of the stories on Walton and Walmart, what you'll hear is the brilliant strategy of setting up shop, where there weren't like large other retailers in these places that weren't like deep urban areas and all this sort of stuff. And yet when you read an interview that was done with Walton contemporaneously at the time, he said, oh, well, my wife told me there's no way she was moving to a big city. So that's what made the decision of where he was going to set up shop.
I've never heard that. But that, your other thing is I just adored Herb Kelleher. He and I, the first time we ever met, he was really pissed off at me, but with a smile, because I don't think it was on TV, though I did do something on TV. It may have been in a column that I used to write. And I said, it's the little things that give away problems. And my wife and I were on I was on a Southwest flight, and there were stains on the coffee table. And I said, my concern is if there's stains on the flip down table, my question is, what about the mechanics? And Herb just lit into me, and we became incredible. I said, Herb, I believe it. And he said, you were right, of course, but he said, I'll never forgive you as long as I live. And so, and the other one, remember, did you ever meet Colleen Barrett? She started out as an admin assistant and finished as the Southwest president, which in ye olde days, as 1,000 times better than I, was not exactly the normal position that a woman would be in. That must have been 30, 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. But I just loved Herb. He was great. Yeah.
My favorite Herb Kelleher story is there was a year where I was responsible for running the Strategic Management Society annual conference. I was the program chair for it. And we managed to talk him into coming and sharing his perspectives. And we were partnering with Booz Allen, who was our consulting partner at the time. And of course, no Herb Kelleher meeting would be complete without Wild Turkey. So we created this roll-up bar with this bottle of Wild Turkey on it, showed a couple of Herb videos, and then this guy from Booz Allen interviewed Herb, while sipping this Wild Turkey.
Oh, I love it. Oh.
It was amazing. And I thought to myself, well, at least I've accomplished the unstuffing of a stuffy academic conference.
I didn't do Wild Turkey, but there was some little video thing I was doing, and it was in Chicago. And we filmed for about an hour and a half. Every 30 minutes, we had to take a cigarette break for her. That was the big two: Wild Turkey and cigarettes. Now, listen, I want to change topics for a minute because, as you know, I use Twitter a lot. Mm-hmm. One thing, and I'm embarrassed that it hasn't been more of what I've done, and folks like you are better at it than me. In my latest book, I really talked about the moral responsibility of business. And I said, Rita, and you tell me your experience, I said, I went to the Stanford Business School. My MBA was 70 to 72. My professors, without exception, were absolutely lovely people and fine human beings. But I said, I obviously don't trust myself at my advanced age, but I'm not sure I ever heard the word moral per se used in the active classroom. Mm-hmm. And, my bias is it ought to be in every classroom. And I don't care what the context is. I don't give a damn how you use it, casually, deeply, or what have you, but it ought to be way, way, way in the center of the radar screen. And my biases, particularly in marketing and finance courses. How would you respond to that relative to the word? I've become kind of a petulant little son of a bitch about that topic of late.
Well, I think, there's a big knock against business schools. And I'll sort of trace it to a series of other changes. So you've already mentioned our buddy Milton Friedman. And if you look at what I'll call the financialization of the US economy, and you draw a map of how much of our economy is in financial services of some kind, and it goes like that, right? And then you draw a map of the growth of business schools, and it goes like that. And so I think there's a subtlety here, which is that business schools were essentially about serving one industry. Right. And I have an old friend who was at Columbia when I first started there, and he'd been there quite a while, and he was bemoaning this shift. He said, it's like we're building a racetrack, right? And everybody here wants to sell the tickets. There's another person that wants to set the odds. There's another one that wants to, organize the upper and under on the betting stage and do the calculations on the algorithm. Nobody wants to ride the damn horse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think when you talk about the inclusion of a moral dimension, I think it means we've got to get away from these abstractions and start talking about organizations as living entities with people in them. And I don't think we do enough of that. We talk about abstraction. I like to talk about strategy, right? And where did strategy come from? Well, strategy in the academic sense came from industrial economics. And it makes two assumptions that I really challenge. The first is that industries exist. In my world, industries morph and change and blow into each other, and there's not a clear demarcation. But the second one is that the natural state of affairs is equilibrium, because all of your economic models fall apart if you don't have an equilibrium to resort to, right? So the math gets a lot more complicated. And I think those two assumptions have been very misleading for a lot of people. So to come back to the idea of a moral responsibility, I think it extends beyond just kind of doing the right thing. It extends to what's your responsibility to these human beings who are going to, in an unpredictable, uncertain environment, give of themselves to your cause, and I think that's a lot of what leadership is about. And that's a two-way street, right? So I'll tell you something that inspires me. I was just reading this morning, Chobani, the yogurt people, are going through an IPO, and their CEO has said, I'm going to give 10% of the benefit of this income that we're going to get to the employees. He said, I've watched with my own eyes. They built this company with their hard work, and this is not a gift. This is the way it should be. And I thought, whoa, you don't see that every day.
Praise the Lord. I had Chobani this morning for breakfast. So I'm
on the side of the angels.
Totally in line with you in that regard. Yeah, I mean the word you used that I particularly love is community. Any organization is a human community. And the other one, and I was talking about this with my colleague Shelley, I think, or with somebody recently, is family. And I've heard people say, and I precisely understand what they're talking about, that if you use family in organization, it sounds paternalistic, and it can. But my comment is, unless you were born with a silver spoon, the reality is, as much as you love your family, you are going to spend more of your alive, living, breathing hours at your job than you will with your family. And, I tend to be rude. And I said, and if you aren't engaged in that way when you're working setting, you're literally pissing your life away. And I said, it's pure quant. It's pure quant. I got more hours at work than I do with family, as much as I adore my family and would love to be with my family and so on. But and I suspect Columbia was this way, and we all know Wharton was this way, which has nothing to do with Wharton graduates of any particular sort. But I took an organizational behavior course as one of the core courses, but we didn't take it seriously. It was like, because, we talk about this incidentally, I want to, we haven't got forever. When I use the word business school without kindness, I want to make sure that I use medical school and engineering school as well. I'm a Cornell engineer by training. And, so I went to Cornell, and Cornell engineering school has decided we needed to be a little bit more well-rounded. So we took an English course. First of all, Cornell engineers, and probably some are watching this, and my apology, I'm one too. We were the most arrogant bastards God ever put on earth. We all knew that we were gifts to humanity, but were we just crapheads relative to having to take this damn psychology course. What in the hell am I doing taking a history course? And we were awful. And, I think from one book, if you haven't read it, and the authors would love to be, at least one of them who I've Zoom met. Have you heard of or seen Compassionomics?
No.
Oh God, it's fabulous. And it's perfect title. Compassionomics, the revolutionary scientific evidence that caring makes a difference. And it is written by two MD researchers, and you more than 99% of people know what I'm going to say next. They are hard-nosed, tight-ass professors. They wouldn't say the sun. It was like I said to somebody, my thesis was incredibly long, and it was because my thesis advisor, if I said the sun rose, and if I didn't cite Newton, I would be, set back for a refill. So the notes are bigger than the thesis. But at any rate, it is experiment after experiment after experiment. And the one that sticks in my mind, which brought me to tears, is which doesn't happen in today's world. And I just had prostate surgery, so I know damn well it didn't happen. If a doctor, and the number is a precise number, which they explain why, if a doctor makes 37 consecutive seconds of eye contact with a patient, hospitalization drops by about 30%. Big numbers. Complications drop by about 30%. And particularly in the new modern day of neuropsychology, we're beginning to learn how important these things are. But the whole book is loaded with that. And I said to somebody, I love the horrible title Compassionomics, because that means he's taken dead aim at the MBAs who run the damned hospitals. During the pandemic, I said, if I were in charge, the new rule would be no hospital administrator is allowed to have an MBA or to be male. And if we can get those two things done, we can turn the industry around. And for better, for worse. We got to tell you one other little thing. Oh God, I love this experiment even more, and I'm really hopeless this way. So you go in, and this is tight ass research too. You go in for a CAT scan, and the tech, of course, does not read the CAT scan. He takes your picture wherever you happen to be, New York or where I am. And the tech, when he starts out, he asks you if it's okay for the sake of the records, could he use his iPhone and take a photo? So we take a photo of you. And the research is, and then the radiologist reads it. And he may well be next door, and he may well be in Sri Lanka, for heaven's sakes, in today's world. And the radiologist reads it with all of its charts and graphs and numbers. But when it comes up initially on the radiologist's screen, there's the photo of you. So that's the case. And the word they use in the research paper is anomalies. What a radiologist is looking for is anomalies. We know what we're kind of looking for with your problem or my problem, but they're looking for weird stuff that doesn't fit. And they call them anomalies, and they count them. So we're looking for anomalies, and we count the anomalies, et cetera. 3 months later, with 300 radiologists, 3 months later, they send the same data on you back to the radiologists, only this time it doesn't start with a photo. And with the photo, as opposed to without the photo, the radiologists spend 50% more time. But the really fantastic thing is, when we got rid of the photo, 80% of the anomalies that were discovered the first time weren't reported. You just didn't see them. And honest to God, I would love to teach an entire course at Columbia University Business School around that one piece. But first of all, I admit I'm a total sucker for things like that. But I love that. A freaking photo comes up, and they said then they did some measures afterwards that are either good or bad, but the empathy goes through the bloody roof. There's a human being. Mm-hmm. And you can't help it. You don't want to do it. You don't want to be any more intimate, but God and your neurobiology makes you so. But it's kind of my favorite thing. Everybody I talk to now, I do exactly what I just did to you, and that is bore the hell out of them with that story. I
love that story.
Love it.
I love that story. Well, and we talk a lot about and one of the things I'm fascinated by is there is this mountain of research by people like Jeffrey Pfeffer and Zeynep Ton and many, many, many others that prove if you have a humanly oriented organization, in other words, you treat people fairly, you treat them with respect, you give them agency, so they've got control over their working conditions, you're not unreasonable in terms of your demands, you're not shrieking and screaming all the time, and you're not sort of showing off all this stuff, right? And it's unambiguous. The performance effects are positive. And yet you look at how many organizations operate, and it's just awful. It's toxic. And I was recently speaking to someone who wrote a whole book on the burnout epidemic, right? And we know what causes it. I mean, this is the other fascinating thing, which is there are antidotes to this. And so one of the eternally haunting questions for me is the data are unambiguous. Your radiologist story is an example, but that's just one example. There are thousands. So the data are ambiguous. People are reporting that they're not happy. I mean, this thing isn't being called the Great Resignation for nothing. People are literally saying it is not worth the precious minutes of my life that you're going to ask me to spend to be in this place, even virtually. And yet so many executives, MBAs, leaders just operate as though none of that were important.
Yeah, no, I could not agree, alas, more wholeheartedly. And I'm not sure why. I mean, one subset of what you're talking about, and it was never part of my work for years and years, and I have utterly no idea why I started talking about it, is you're running a 500-person organization. We'll forget the Fortune 500, but it's a real organization with 500 people. Is the complete population of first-line leaders. And everything I can find says every variable from cost to productivity to quality is overwhelmingly driven by those people. And if there's a place I want to work, I mean, me, Tom Peters, as a researcher, but if there's a thing I want to work on, it is the quality of the complete set of, do you ever read Marcus Buckingham's work? Mm-hmm. I'm a great Marcus fan. And again, I love the fact that he was Gallup, so you can't call him soft.
Right?
Always looking for, sources that I can shove down somebody's throat who is a quant by saying, the person who found this is quantier than you are. And I use it. I'm shameless. I said, I got 4 quant degrees. Just get the hell out of my way. But Marcus's thing is just focused. He wrote an entire book that was fundamentally focused on first line leaders. And of course, the problem is that unless the people who are in charge of the first line leaders look at it that way, that ain't going to be the essence of their selection process. And I know it's boring, but I was in the Navy for 4 years, and
I was going to bring up that question.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there's no issue. That there is no issue whatsoever. The Army is as good as its sergeants, period, all stop, comma, and they know it. And the other one I use the military example for is I said, is training important? Is it a capital investment? Well, how about asking an admiral, a general, a fire chief, a police chief, the operational head of a nuclear power plant, so what the hell is the difference between that and a Walmart store or a 27 staff retailer a mile from you or a mile from me? And the answer is nothing, but they put it in the first place. I will tell you one last story on that topic. My parents didn't have any money. And the United States Navy decided to pick up the entire tab for my 4 years tuition at Cornell. And since they were kind enough to do that, I was kind enough to give them 4 years of my life. And right before I went on active duty, thinking of Iraq as an analogy, Lyndon Johnson, many of the people watching us won't even know this story at all, Lyndon Johnson made up the Tonkin Gulf incident. And the next thing you knew, we were in Vietnam. And the next thing I knew, I was in Vietnam. And the chief petty officers run the Navy. But the technical reality is that I landed in Da Nang, Vietnam, as a Navy ensign in August of 1966. And as of the next day, I was in charge of a little group of people, probably a dozen people who were in the engineering department. The chief does the real work. Yes, I completely acknowledge that. But legally speaking, as of that moment, I was responsible for the life or death in a combat zone of a dozen people. And what was my training? Zip. I mean, I came back the way my part of the Navy did it. We went to Vietnam for 9 months. We came home for 3, and then we went back for another 9. When I came back, I drove to Cornell. Came back to home, and home was Maryland. I drove up to Cornell, and I pounded on the dean's office. And I will, since this is a family gathering, I will not use the language, but I went in and I said, "You effed me over." I said, I could have redesigned the Verzano Narrows Bridge blindfolded and with 2 hands tied behind my back. But suddenly, and the point being that anybody who's a Cornell engineering graduate or something like that, unless you're a total screw up, you're going to be in charge of something within 24 months. It's maybe an 8-person project team working on something that only lasts for a month and a half, but you're going to be in a leadership role. And just no background for it. And you know, as I said, my life's work, and you know, I'm now too old to have it be that much into the future, is, and there are a million others, law schools, ed schools, and so on, but med schools, engineering schools, and business schools. And you know, with absolutely no quantitative background or support, they're on my 3 bad guys list. And I don't understand it. You're right in the middle of it. I mean, I heard that med schools, and I really don't believe it, but I've heard that some med schools are looking at EQ in the admissions process.
They're starting to.
True.
Yeah, they're starting to. And I think I do think business schools at some level are making an effort. But it's you know, there's a lot of headwinds, and you know, I'm very reminded of the work of William Baumol, who was this incredibly influential economist. Again, I got quant guy, right? And he said, you know, if you want to figure out where entrepreneurial talent is going to be directed in your society, you have to look at the structure of incentives. And his conclusion was entrepreneurship can be directed towards productive outcomes. You know, you add value, you innovate, you do good things. It can be directed towards unproductive outcomes. And he would make the argument that the entire financial sector is basically unproductive. You know, you're allocating capital, but you're not actually creating value. Or destructive behavior. So if you're in the kind of a society where, you know, corruption, bribery, gang trading, you know, that kind of thing is the only way to get to a reward, that's the kind of entrepreneurship behavior you're going to get. And I've always been very struck by that when I think about how institutions like business schools or med schools or whatever try to change, is it so often they're not addressing the structure of incentives at all. And until you get that fixed, you're not going to have the change in behavior. It's like I was talking to somebody, I know you'll love this. So I was talking to some people at a consulting firm, and they've all got their functions in the consulting firm, right? So there's a group that does advisory on X and a group that does advisory on Y. And they're making this big effort, right, to say, what we want to come to the client with is a unified front. We bring all these talents together. And that's the strategic move we want to make. And I'm like, well, okay, but how are these people being, you know, at the end of the year, how are they being rewarded? And of course, they're being rewarded for individual hourly contribution and penetration of their function into the client. So they have zero incentive to sort of say, oh, and here's my buddy over in the other function within my firm. You know?
Yeah.
You see that everywhere.
Well, I did a little thing once on cross-functional communication, and it's just exactly analogous to what you just said. I said, literally, there should be a quantitative measure on, during the last 30 days, how many lunches has Rita had with people in other functions? And I said, I will bet you lunch beats a $75 million investment in one of those enterprise software pieces.
Those awful knowledge management systems.
The awful knowledge management systems. Yes, absolutely. And I really think I'm totally convinced that's the case.
So there's a really fun new book out by Liz Wiseman, who wrote the book Multipliers, and her book Multipliers is exactly about your frontline manager concept, right?
Oh, is that right? Yeah, I know Liz a little bit. I haven't read.
Yeah. So, but her latest book, she said, was prompted by a conversation she had with one of these guys who kind of in a moment of despair said to her, Liz, you can't multiply zero. And what he meant by that was you got to have something to work with, right? And so her latest book, which I find absolutely fascinating, looks at, now these are admittedly high performing companies. So they have the right context in which individual contributors can thrive. But she makes a distinction between people who kind of come in and do their job, they're contributors, and what she calls impact players. And what I thought was so interesting was these impact players are behaving the way that you've always talked about. So they see
we have always been talking.
Well, me too, right? But they see, like uncertainty as an opportunity, and unambiguous roles mean they move in and do the job that needs to be done, whatever it is. They take leadership when needed, but they also can step back when needed. And she sort of, what I thought was interesting about the book is she really lays out at a kind of a granular level what it is that these people behave like. And I thought that was interesting. And so if you get that right, and you get these multiplier frontline leaders, right, it all sort of multiplies again. And again, it's back to this human factor. And one of the things she does talk about is kindness. There's this sort of moral responsibility to one another and being kind and doing what needs to be done, even if on the surface it doesn't look like it's going to be a big reward for you. Just really interesting stuff.
Well, speaking as someone who's 1,000 years old and thinking of the day on which we're speaking, I am actually, nobody can ever say Joe Biden is an old man to me. He is exactly 13 days younger than I am. I was born on November 7th. He was born on November 20th in 1942. And I one time years ago, before maybe it was me vice president or maybe the Senate, I met him and I said, around my house, you are referred to as young Joe. And so, but anyway, I don't even remember my point. The wonderful thing about the age I am, the short-term memory is gone. So
you never get bored.
Older people who are watching us, because I'm gonna give them 50 times their money's worth in 1 minute. I had a great shrink friend. And at one point I said to him, I said, I just can't remember where I put something down 10 minutes ago. But what he said, and this is a very serious conversation, it has nothing to do with our official content. He said, I will never promise you that you will not get Alzheimer's. I will never promise you that you will not get dementia. But I will statistically promise you that the fact that you can't remember where you put your iPad down has zero correlation with Alzheimer's or dementia. It's just your short-term memory is gone. Get over it. Try to live with it. And then I have a great doctor in Boston I go to. It's funny, and it wasn't triggered by that comment because I didn't talk to him about it. And we were talking about something. I'd had my 6-month checkup and done reasonably well. And I was complaining about short-term memory. He said, Tom, and we've become good friends. He said, there's only one way that I know that you can ruin your life. And I said, well, sounds good. He said, that is, you will ruin your life if you worry about your loss of short-term memory. And if we have any old farts, not necessarily my age, but, youngsters who are a mere 60 or 55, I come to the conclusion he's got a damn good point. So I don't remember what the hell I was going to say to you a couple of minutes ago, but there it is.
It had to do with kindness.
Yeah, I know it had to do with kindness, but I can't remember what it had to do with. I mean, my favorite. I always have got quotes, and my favorite kindness quote: Henry James. three things in human life are important. The first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind. And did you ever see, oh, I loved it so much. David, I think this came out of a book of his, but it was in a column. David Brooks distinguished between what he called resume variables and eulogy resume virtues and eulogy virtues.
I love that.
Oh, I just adored it. And the resume virtues, of course, are, I went to Harvard, I was promoted 17 times by the age of 42, et cetera, et cetera. And the eulogy virtues were, how did she or he treat people? Peggy Noonan, when Tim Russert, the journalist, died 10 or 15 years ago, or I don't remember when it was exactly, Peggy Noonan had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And her op-ed said, anybody who dealt with Tim Russert knew that he wasn't a pushover when you were interviewing. He was tough, he got to the point, and so on. But the thing that people will really remember him about is he was just fabulous to his fellow human beings. And I was moved by both of those things. And I don't know.
I hear you're thinking about, just speaking of, life values, you're thinking about your next project being a bit of a reflection, a memoriam, a retrospective.
Okay, and your next topic on the list. Yeah, I sort of am.
Mm-hmm.
My biggest problem is that I think a memoir, and I know they can be different and be very good, but it sounds so arrogant.
Mm.
It sounds, I would hope that I've obviously had some luck, and I would hope that I'm not arrogant. And I know some people think I'm not, and I'm sure I've been arrogant with others, but the memoir thing, I think I may end up doing it, but I'm really having a hard time persuading myself, because as you know as well as I, if you do a book, it doesn't emerge in the next 90 days. That's for damn sure. And I don't know. I blow hot and cold every day.
Mm-hmm. Can I offer you some inspiration?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so when I was doing my PhD at the Wharton School, I took this organizational diagnosis course, and the professor who was trying to teach us, I mean, I was pretty pissed off with him at the time, because what he forced us to do was read a book a week and write a 5-page analysis of the book, and it had to be of the same style. Sorry?
I said, wow, God bless you.
I know. And I mean, this was on top of 4 other pretty heavy duty workload courses. And he, we sort of, early on, we were sort of like, well, how are we possibly going to do that? And he said, you're going to learn to read like a graduate student by doing this. And I thought, okay, so that's the bar. But I picked Peter Drucker. And every week I read a Peter Drucker book quickly. And the one that I was really struck by was a book he wrote called Adventures of a Bystander, in which he makes
the title. Yeah.
It's a great title, Adventures of a Bystander. And the point that he makes in that book was that he was never a manager. He was never like a leader of multiple people. He was someone who observed deeply, and from those observations shared his insights with others. But he never actually was in that role. And he said he had known that from the time he was very young, that he was going to be this observant bystander and not a player, as it were. And I thought that was very inspiring. And, we know he's had an outside impact on thinking even today. In fact, just today, I was part of a panel at the Drucker Forum. And people are still like discovering his wisdom even today. So if that could be an inspiration, I think.
Yeah, I get that point. Incidentally, I completely, in my presentations, I always use a lot of PowerPoints, and 85% of them are quotes. And I said, let me tell you the reason I'm doing this. The reason I'm doing this is I've never led anything. And there is utterly no reason whatsoever why you should pay any attention to me whatsoever. But you can't hide from Richard Branson. and you can't hide from Sam Walton. And so I don't even read what's on the PowerPoint. The entire purpose is this big thing over my shoulder, and it's roughly related to what I'm talking about. And at the bottom is Peter Drucker, Herb Kelleher, Sam Walton, whoever it may be. And I don't think that's a trick. A, I believe it, but B, I think it really is the case. No, I get that. I mean, the other thing I relative to this, I do have to say, you and I are having this conversation. I do not know you personally, but I do know my own life personally, for one and only one reason, and that is blind ass luck. You know, I said to somebody one time, well, I had this wonderful experience. I was in London, and a driver was taking me around from one place to another one day, and I don't know what we were chatting about. And he said at one point, he looked over his shoulder, he said, you know, there are two kinds of people who sit in the back seat of this car. And I said, I'll bite. He said, people who remember their roots and people who think they deserve to be there. And I said to him, I never studied philosophy, but that's as good as anything the Greeks ever spouted. And I think it really is. And I've also said, and I guess I know there's always the danger of quote unquote Tom Peters saying that the three kinds of people in this world I dislike most are mass murderers, child and spouse abusers, and number three is successful people who believe they deserve their success. I do not in any way, shape, or form deserve to be having this conversation with you. Yes, the answer is I worked 25 hours a day for 100 years and so on and so forth. But, you know, there were, you know, as I said, there are a million things a day. You know, I live not in a rural area, but in a place where we have narrow roads and a lot of bicyclists. And when I'm driving to the store an hour from now, if a mosquito flies into my eye, there is a non-trivial chance that I could jerk the wheel and kill a 12-year-old. And there are hundreds of those things that happen every day. And you know, it's you know, you worked your butt off and I worked my butt off, et cetera, et cetera. But we're having this conversation because of, in my half of it, we're having because of 8 jillion items of blind ass luck. And I think it's kind of consistent with what we were saying. I mean, people don't pay attention to that stuff.
Well, we like to impose order where there isn't any. Yeah. As I think as human beings, we kind of crave that. But I want to bring it back to the human dimension because you're right. You know, the world is just full of random stuff. And I heard a wonderful quote the other day, which was that the only thing that ever happens in organizations that is without the only thing you can predict will happen in organizations is confusion, lack of clarity, and politics and underperformance. To not have that happen requires leadership, right? And I think that brings us almost full circle to that idea of a very human leader being someone, you know, you're still beholden to luck to some extent, but to be able to see the patterns and shift the odds a little bit. I think maybe that's where great leaders are. And one of the reasons this sort of management by walking around is so critical is that's where the information lives, right? In people's heads and in people's conversations.
But let's go back to MBWA, and you tell me from your experience. MBWA, and I've written about this, can be what John Young did when he wandered around the engineering spaces. It can also be, relative to the military at its worst, a general followed around by 7 colonels, 9 majors, et cetera, and be a formal act of the worst sort. Mm-hmm. There was this wonderful study, speaking of Wharton, but not directly, that came out of the University of Pennsylvania, and it involved a home care organization. And in the home care industry, And I hope people will check out the source on this because you're not going to believe the number. In the home care industry, and this is before the pandemic, God knows what it is now, the average turnover was 80% a year. And the people at this institute at Penn tried to figure out what was going on, and they studied, what mattered to people, blah, 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 blah. It was good, hard-nosed research. And so they changed their practices. And I think, as one of the authors said, we paid a lot less attention to formal credentials, whether you graduated from Penn or whether you graduated from a junior college somewhere. And they would have these things. They would have, I don't know what the term is today. The old term was social gatherings of candidates. And they would look at the degree to which Rita talked and the degree to which she listened. And they started using these, and the part that maybe you won't even believe it. I mean, it did come from Penn, for God's sake, so you're required to believe it. The turnover number went from 80 or 78 to 1.7 per year. 1.7.
Wow.
And of even more importance, the number of hospitalizations, this was in-home care, it wasn't hospice, it was in-home care, the number of hospitalizations per capita with the clients dropped by about 40%. And it was, they worked their butt off. So at this social, it wasn't, they knew what they were looking for. And one of the other things they asked for, which gets back to something we said before, is community service. Mm-hmm. Even though this was a frontline job, what do you do? And, obviously if you're doing it with a 35-year-old, you might talk about the PTA or something like that, but it was just stuff, some indication that you have been a joiner and a participant in your community. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think I used the research in my last book so you could find the reference, but I was 80 to 1.7.
Incredible.
It's ridiculous. But I don't know about you, I've come to believe numbers like that, and that it is possible to make that dramatic a difference with something. Oh, one thing, just going way back with numbers, and you've referred to this several times. I was talking, I don't remember who it was. It was a Harvard finance person. And I said to him, and I think this is when all the derivative stuff was going down. I said, I totally believe in the financial sector by definition. We need grease to make the system work. But if we counted up all of these trillions of dollars of derivatives and derivatives of derivatives, what percentage of all those instruments do you think are needed to make the economy work? And he smiled and he said, I don't know. We don't know. But he said, my rough guess, and that of my colleagues, is maybe 3 or 4%. Mm-hmm. And I must say, and I'm sure the thing is, it's true for you too, I was not at all surprised.
No. Well, this is what I was alluding to earlier, the financialization.
No, I know. That's what triggered it, is your comment earlier about fundamentally the same topic.
Yeah. So as we sort of move toward the end of our time together, so we're at this unprecedented moment, which is an overused word, but global pandemic, real environmental recognition, this is not going away, social justice protests, and of course the underlying economics of everything being kind of up in the air. Do you think this could be a breakthrough moment or a breakthrough period?
I don't know what I think, but I know what I hope.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Silly I think what you said, I agree with 100% point and a whole bunch of zeros. I hope so. And one reason, and we didn't talk about this, you went to whoopie-doopie-doo Wharton and I went to whoopie-doopie-doo Stanford. That maybe people who do what we do for a living, maybe are business school professors, because I don't think they're very good at this. we act as if the Fortune 500 was the economy. And the reality is it employs something like 7% of us. And I've become a total fanatic on the topic of SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises. And I agree with you and you agree with me. We love Herb Kelleher, we love Sam Walton, blah, 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 blah. But my point now, which is not entirely, I don't give a damn about those 500 CEOs. And relative to this movement, the people I would like to get to are the people who are running 500-person companies, 200-person companies, maybe even 75-person companies, 1,000-person companies. And I think maybe, and I don't have any evidence of this, but I think maybe there's a lot more openness when you get to that level. You take things like the first line supervisor thing. I have a friend who ran, unfortunately, at the age of 55, he had a stroke. He's not running anymore. About a 2/3 of $1 billion chemical company, and I think they had, 2,000 employees or something like that. And I gave a speech, and he really, and I really pray to God I'm not tooting my own horn, but he said, "You really caught me off guard with that first line supervisor thing." And he went back and just did somersaults to work on that. And I think, and I hope, I'm a lot older, I hope your and my peers might look a lot more at the areas where we can really make a difference. And it would really be lovely if Rita McGrath had 27 scalps of Fortune 500 CEOs, and Tom's a little older, so he had 39 scalps. But I think our chance is higher, and I think there could be a revolution at that SME level. And I'm just desperately in love with SMEs for one reason. It is, everything we've said is a hell of a lot easier to do with 500 people than 5,000, let alone 55,000. So screw them. There's a quote that I used in my last book, I think the last two books, to be honest, from this economist whose name is Paul Omerod, and I've forgotten the title. But he said, "I am often asked by people trapped in big companies, how can I create would-be entrepreneurs trapped in big companies? How can I create a small company for myself?" And I said, my answer is always simple: buy a big one and just wait. And it's not trivial. Back to my old McKinsey friends, one of my closest friends there was a guy named Dick Foster, who was a quant. And Dick and a colleague did a study on 40 years of performance of our top 1,000 companies, and not one of them beat the stock market over that period of time.
I remember that. Yeah, innovation, the attacker's advantage.
Mind-boggling. So I do have to say then one thing, and I know we are wandering down. I talked about Dick Foster and McKinsey funded in search of, well, actually Siemens funded in search of excellence. I want to say here in public, I am so royally pissed off at McKinsey and Company for their involvement in the Purdue Pharma thing that I am nauseated. My wife and I are now watching a serial series on TV called Dope Sick, DOPESICK. And it's about the whole Purdue Pharma thing. And I'm in despair. I'm angry. I have lost some senior friends at McKinsey, not that I had many these days a million years later. Because I said, for one thing, I want to see a total house cleaning at the top. I don't want to see any names who were running the place 5 or 10 years ago. And I'm just furious, Rita. I'm angry. I'm enraged. I don't know whether you read the story, but McKinsey being McKinsey, this was on a chart. CVS was a big customer of Purdue, and Purdue was going to start offering $15,000 bonuses to CVS for every one of their opioid clients who became an addict. It's on a slide. I mean, I want, and this is a hell of a thing to say because they were responsible for my life, I want McKinsey to go the way of Arthur Andersen. I think they ought to shut their doors. And by the way, because this came up in Twitter a few days ago, and the woman who said it, who I think is one of the Thinkers 50 people, Louise van Rijn, who is a South African, there is an even more brutal book on Bain and what Bain did. I've forgotten the incident. The book's not published hardback here, but she's sending me one. And, you know, for God's sakes, and yet you look at the list, there's this, I don't know why I have it just so I can be pissed off every day. There's something called Poets and Quants, which is a website, and it's all about MBAs. Bain is the number one person who MBAs want to work for, and McKinsey used to be, but after these problems, they've dropped all the way down to number 3. And in both cases, I'm just, I don't know what, I don't know why I'm venting. I'm just so pissed. In watching this show, I'm 10 times more. But it's all about what we're talking about. How the hell does that kind of integrity go out the door?
Well, and it is particularly disappointing in McKinsey's case because their founding principles were all about, having integrity in your work and not taking work in violation of that. I mean, and I wonder sometimes if, and I think it happens in many kinds of organizations, but, the pressure for whatever, growth, short-term results, whatever it is, sort of gets you to make just this one exception, just this one time, right?
Yeah.
And that leads to another and another and another. And before you know it, you're behaving in a way that even you would regard as completely abhorrent. And I wonder, if that isn't some of what might have happened there.
Oh, I have little doubt of that. I'd also say, when I look back at the McKinsey time, and it's the same thing I said about the Stanford Business School, I worked with 100%. I worked, particularly in the San Francisco office, with people of the highest integrity. But in our work, relative to what we were talking about earlier, I never heard anybody talk about moral leadership or community responsibility. Mm-hmm. We weren't against it. Mm-hmm. That's the stupid statement. We weren't bad people. We were pretty good people. But it was never, on the plate, as it were. And that's terribly troublesome.
Well, and I think perhaps this moment that we're in is going to help us have more of those conversations. That would be my hope, because we're starting to realize, employers are kind of getting the message now that people are not just badly performing robots, that they matter, and that the communities they create matter, and that the responsibility you take for the harm that you do in the world matters. And I think we are now, at least we have permission to have that conversation. I think.
Well, and I think another big thing that'll help that is we know now that lifetime employment is dead. And as somebody said to me, in the old days when Rita, age 38, applied for a job, if she had had 5 jobs, we would say, this is a disloyal job jumper. In 2021, if Rita hasn't had 5 jobs, we say, where the hell is her, her innovation and entrepreneurial? Exactly. And that's a huge deal.
It is
because of exactly what you said before, that kind of an attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tom Peters, I cannot thank you enough for spending some time on your thoughts, and I hope to be continued with this conversation.
Oh, I would love that, Rita.
Absolutely.
I have pure, raw, unfair, unmitigated fun in the last hour. And, I think this is I don't really know you very well, obviously, but I really think we come from the same place, and in many, many, many respects, we have, to an almost embarrassing level, the same kind of background. And I feel like I've been talking to an old pal. So this has been
that's great. Absolutely
and
great.
You can't talk about this stuff unless you feel that way.
Right. People kind of shut you down. So anyway, thank you so much. Enjoy the warmth or the chill, or we're cold enough here. I've actually got the fire on. So.
I love the fire on. Yeah.
Starting to be.
Yours is up a little bit. My wife and I finally gave up on wood and shifted to propane a couple of years ago. And I hate to say it, but we're reasonably happy with that.
There you go. All right. Well, on
We're
that
not-
note,
Third shelf would be a real problem, but
well, this one's been all carefully constructed and insulated
oh,
for this
yeah,
purpose.
no,
Well, lovely to chat to you, and to be continued.